So glad to have you today on the Terry Sullivan Show, and I'm so excited about my guest today because I love this man. I've known him a long time, and we're going to get into his life, his family. You know, we have a saying around here. Actually, I heard my dad say it, I don't know how many times, and it's Texas born, Texas bred. When we die, we're Texas dead. Well, this is Russell Kerbow, former chief of police in Lewisville, Texas. Born and raised in East Texas, moved to Lewisville. All of his law enforcement days were in Lewisville, and that spans over 40 years. So I'm excited to get into it, Chief. It's so good to have you today.
Hey, Terry. Well, thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming on. I know you're retired, but you stay busy all the time.
Man, I don't know how I had time to work before. I'm just so busy now doing so many different things, you know. Retirement's been kind of a nice change of pace for Becky and I to be able to travel, which is kind of what we wanted to fill our retirement years with. And then that stupid COVID jumped in there and kind of broke things up a little bit.
Yeah, but well, even with that though, Chief, you're still very involved in the city and raising bonds and money for the new facility going in. We're going to get into that later on.
Sure.
But you need to retire from retirement.
It almost feels like that sometimes. You know, we catch ourselves coming and going a little bit at times. You know, since retirement, I've had a chance to spend more time at church and volunteer and doing some of the things that I love doing. Mm-hmm. You know, and things that maybe I put off in my youth to kind of resume now that I'm retired and I have the time to do it.
Well, I mean, everybody knows, or they should know, that law enforcement consumes you.
It does.
And you joined the Lewisville Police Department in 1978.
Yes, the regular force.
And you were on the police force for how many years before you became chief of police?
So that would have been 29. Yeah, something like that.
So you moved to Lewisville because your mom and dad liked it. They liked the old town feel of it. At what time did you say, you know what, I'm going to be a policeman?
Well, so I had friends of mine. I did a lot of jobs out of high school, worked in the grocery store business, and I was actually managing one of the local 7-Eleven stores at the time. And a couple of buddies of mine from high school were on the police department at the time. And they would come into the store and, to buy sodas or take their break or whatever it was for the night. And they were the ones that were influential in talking to me into at least joining the reserve program. Mm-hmm. So at the time we had a reserve police force that, strictly volunteer. You go to a abbreviated police school, police training that you'd have to do. And then you really only had the authority when you were riding with a regular police officer in a car. Mm-hmm. So I thought, well, man, that sounds kind of fun. So let me just get into that and do it. And I just fell in love with it. And I think it's because, even in the grocery business, it's all about service and people. Mm-hmm. And it's all about service and people when you get into law enforcement. Mm-hmm. You get a chance there to come in when somebody's having probably the worst day of their life. Mm-hmm. And if we can take control, help them take more control of that and kind of straighten things out for them, then the better off that everybody is.
Chief, how in numbers as far as police officers, how many police officers did Lewisville have back in 1978?
I was number 33.
33.
We not very many people at all. I think we had about 10 clerical staff, and that included dispatchers and records clerks and a couple secretaries.
And of course, the population back in 1978 in Lewisville was what, maybe 15, 20,000.
Oh, it's like under 10.
Under 10.
Yeah.
I grew up in Farmers Branch, and so I tell people this frequently. We had absolutely no reason to come to Lewisville, and it seemed like a long way off.
Yeah.
I remember when they built this I think that they first called it Granny's Fried Chicken off I-35, and I remember we used to come here on Sunday afternoon, and it seemed like after church, this would be our go-to place, and it seemed like an all-day affair. And now, well, it's 10 minutes down the road.
Yeah,
everything's connected.
Yeah, it's funny how it all seemed a lot further away back then, but it's hop, skip, and a jump now. You're anywhere in the Metroplex.
Chief, you watched Lewisville. I mean, you've seen a lot of growth through the years. Mm-hmm. What has changed as far as law enforcement? In your last 20 years, how did law enforcement change? Some good and some bad.
Well, of course, the technology that used by both law enforcement and the bad guys have changed a whole lot. You think, take drug dealing, for example. You had to have a network set up where, you knew somebody, you went to them, or they came to you to sell you, hand in hand drugs and everything. Now it's all over the smartphone. I'm the drug dealer. I take a picture of my product and I send it to a network of people, and then they kind of bid, or we talk about price over the phone, and that's how you cut that deal and work out a way to meet up, where it's less risk to both parties to be able to make that delivery. So now, that makes it tough on law enforcement too.
Yeah, how do you combat that?
Yeah, so we were experimenting a little bit when I retired with those social media sniffers, they call them, basically, where you can kind of key in on keywords that are transacted over social media platforms, and some of those can give you a clue into what you're doing, and then you can do an undercover thing on social media. I can create an identity as a bad guy, or a drug user or something, and kind of work my way in to that network that way.
Chief, are drugs, are they as plentiful today as they were 20 years ago?
I would say probably more plentiful. And again, it's the ability, our transportation has improved and increased. We can be anywhere, pretty quick. So that helps also the drug trade to be able to flourish a little bit more. Mm-hmm. And then of course through social media and our smartphones, mm-hmm. You could cut those deals pretty quick and make arrangements. So I would say it's a lot more plentiful.
Harder to
drugs
catch.
are flowing in from south of the border. Mm-hmm. You got I-35E right through Lewisville, and that's the main conduit for drug distribution everywhere in the U.S.
And the dealers are harder to catch. They're
much harder.
They're deeper undercover. You were police chief for 11 years, mm-hmm. retired in 2018.
Right.
When you took that job, what was the one thing that you went home to Becky and you went, man, I didn't know it was like that?
Well, I had a little bit of an insight onto what the job would be like, through my previous boss. Steve McFadden was the police chief in Lewisville for 29 and a half years before I took over from him in 2007, if you can imagine that. Now, he carried us from about the same time I started through that point, and he really he focused a lot on systems and policies and making sure that our department acted in a responsible way, caring for people as much as we possibly can, always trying to do the right thing by people. And so, he set a great foundation for what our department should be operating like. And quite honestly, my desire to want to be police chief was selfish for protecting our department. I didn't necessarily want somebody from the outside coming in and changing up the model that Chief McFadden had created mm-hmm. along that way. Mm-hmm. I thought the only way I could protect it is to apply for the job, and if I got it, then I could ensure that moving forward we'd be as good a department, if not better.
Mm-hmm. What were some changes that you made going in? Now, I know Chief McFadden did a great job, and everybody speaks highly of him. But everybody speaks highly of you, Chief. I don't know of anybody that's I've ever mentioned your name. And coming into this interview, I talked to a lot of people, and a lot of former police officers, a lot of current police officers, about Chief Kerbow. And the accolades just go on forever. What were some things that you did that even today that you're very proud of?
Well, one of the very first things I did was get us involved in the Texas Police Chiefs Association Best Practices system. And what that amounts to is there have been a group of current and retired police chiefs who went in and said, to be considered a member of the best practices in law enforcement, a police department should, and they listed 160 some odd different traits and categories that you should meet. And so then they said, okay, we think that's what they should consist of. How do we make sure that people can actually meet that? And so they created a manual of things that you had to have written in policy, and what your facilities ought to look like. And then they would send inspectors to your agency to review all that stuff. It's one thing to say, I do A, B, or C, but they wanted to see proof that you actually do that, just like you say you do. And so we would have to have proofs in our files that show that if we have a policy, say, for incarceration, how do we keep people safe in a jail and, care for them each day and all that kind of thing. Well, we had to demonstrate proofs that we actually followed the policy that we had written. And so I knew that we were a good department at the time, but I knew this would also uncover some gaps that we might have, because we always thought we were really good at doing certain things, but try to hold yourself to this kind of standard is going to reveal whether or not you really are meeting all those needs or not.
Right.
And sure enough, we found some things, excuse me, some areas that we weren't quite as proficient in as we should have been. And we were able to kind of shore that up. And I think when I retired, we were on your recognition status is good for like 4 years, and there's a cost that you have to pay. And I think we're on our 4th re-recognition. So I'm hoping that they continue to do that at Lewisville PD.
Sure. This deal with license to carry, such a controversy just nationwide. Good, bad, get rid of guns, going to come and get them, not going to come and get them. Chief, where are you at in all of that?
Right there.
Right there. Okay.
No, I'll be honest with you, when they first started talking about license to carry, when it very, very first came out, I thought it was going to be like the Wild Wild West, that we'd have a lot of conflict and, shootouts in the street and that kind of thing. And fortunately, I was proven wrong. It ended up being not a big deal at all. And I think what changed my mindset about that whole thing was the people that apply for that license and get trained to be able to carry that weapon are actually good people to start with.
Right.
And so then it's a simple thing. If there's more good people carrying guns than there are bad people, then you're probably going to have a safer community.
Right.
And I think that's what we ended up having in Lewisville for sure.
Sure. And, the argument is, well, if you take all the guns away from the good people, the bad people, they're going to get guns anyway.
Well, laws only apply to law-abiding people. And most of the bad guys are not law-abiding people. So for me, it's not very hard to figure out that, taking guns from those of us who would follow the law if it was the law and give up our weapons, that leaves us unarmed. It's like telling the sheep herder, we don't need you today. Go away.
Right.
We're sure no wolves will come in and take our sheep away.
Right. That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Chief, would you mind, let's talk about, if you don't mind, let's talk about the Uvalde situation. That's still fresh.
Yeah.
What as a former chief of police, what should have been the protocol and the process from the perspective of the police chief?
Well, I could tell you that, the active shooters in schools is not a new thing. Active shooters just in public places is not a real new thing. And law enforcement has been training for the past 20 some odd years on the proper ways to deal with an active shooter situation. And so first and foremost is to stop the killing. And so the first people that show up on scene are in charge. Ideally, you'd like to have a team of 4 that would go into a building to seek out the shooter. But if you've only got 2 there, then you 2 go in. And there's no waiting around for anything. You go in, you seek out that shooter, and you neutralize them. And that's what should have happened in Uvalde. I mean, it's just, and I'll tell you, I've told this to a lot of people too about incidents that occur around the country. I wasn't there. I'm not seeing the evidence that is being uncovered at the Uvalde thing or any of the other big shootings that have gone on. And so it's kind of hard to, armchair quarterback that thing.
Yeah.
Unless you've seen all the evidence, you've got all the information. There has been a report that has come out by the same group that has prescribed that training for all law enforcement for dealing with active shooters. And they point out quite a few issues with the response in Uvalde. And so there were some errors made, but across the board, not, you really can't just point to one area or another to say, this is right, this is wrong, or anything like that. So if you want to call it blame, there's plenty of blame to go around with this thing. Lots of things went wrong.
Yeah.
Clearly officers were drawn into the school where they should have been pretty early in this scenario. What they didn't do is they just didn't follow through what they were supposed to do. They were worried about taking fire or, Lord knows what. But there's no way that it should have gone on for as long as it did without getting that shooter neutralized.
Yeah, yeah.
The other thing we talk about is caring for the wounded too. And I know I'm very proud of the training that we've had at Lewisville because we practice with our paramedics. And we go in and, we're early on in the active shooter training, we considered that a hot zone and nobody could go in there except law enforcement until we cleared the entire building. Well, our mindset's changed a little bit now where it is possible to go in and clear parts of a building, and that creates a warm zone that now you can move medical people in and they can start triaging the wounded and the casualties to try to get them medical care as soon as possible. And I think that does actually save lives. We know that people bleed out and succumb to their injuries. We don't all die just because we got shot.
Yeah.
And a lot of that's in our head more than anything. Now, if you think because you got shot you're going to die, well, you probably will. But you don't have to necessarily die just because you get shot.
Right.
Depends on where you get shot and how vital the injuries are. So we know we can save lives by getting paramedics in there sooner. So we trained with our paramedics in Lewisville to be able to come in and, they've got the same kind of protective ballistic armor that our police officers would wear to be able to come in and, give them some sense of protection while they can treat the wounded and even get them moved out of there.
Yeah. Chief, how damaging has social media been to law enforcement?
Well, they haven't been entirely kind to us, I'll tell you that. And regardless of where an incident occurs, whether it's in Uvalde, Texas, or it's in Chicago, Illinois, or anywhere else around the country as far as that goes, law enforcement takes a hit every single time. When somebody does something wrong, we are all painted with that same brush.
Right.
Whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent, it's just a fact of life. And that didn't just start recently. That was the Rodney King stuff in the early 80s. People started carrying around video cameras, and it was, of course, it was a lot harder back then because the big old thing you put on your shoulder, to have to carry around. So now everybody's got a smartphone. Everybody's a cinematographer.
Right.
They're taking video. And the problem with some of that is nobody has a say on how much of that video is going to be shown, to what level and to whom. People share parts of video that doesn't tell the entire story. And one of the things I've always talked about, even when we moved into body-worn cameras, it's still just a two-dimensional image. It's, there's a spatial awareness about a person that cannot be recreated with the camera, at least not yet.
Right.
So the video doesn't always tell the entire story. There's things that happen off camera that the actors that are involved are aware of. If something was to pop up behind the counter over here, it might get caught on camera, but it might not.
Right. It's difficult being a police officer today, opposed to back
Does seem like it.
40 years ago. We hear all the time that police departments are short on officers and have a hard time finding good candidates to fill those positions. A lot of veterans leaving early, wanting out of the law enforcement. It's hard. Stress of it's hard. The job is hard. Dealing with the public's hard. Are there any answers?
Well, I think one real answer, and I think a major point that police departments should look at in order to try to recruit new members is to say, okay, lots of talk about police reform these days. That's kind of what we're talking about. Everybody, in about every 20 or 30 years, somebody comes up with a real need for police reform. And that's not anything new. It's been going on since the 20s and 30s. So, if you think that police need to be reformed, then you need to join us and help make those changes.
Right.
If you're a young person out there and you think that we need to be changed in some way, well, you need to be the change. Come join us and become one of us, and let's change it together.
That's a great point. Chief, whenever back in 2020, nobody likes to talk about 2020, but all of a sudden we have a movement going around the country to defund police.
Mm-hmm.
Is that one of those things where you sit back in your chair and you go, this world has gone crazy?
Well, I mean, sometimes, I think most of us recognize that that's an emotional cry from part of our community that thinks that that's the answer to it. And I would hope that deep down they don't really believe that. And, maybe some people did. And it started with the incidents up in Minnesota,
Mm-hmm.
And all those issues that have translated throughout communities in the whole U.S. And so, but defunding the police is not going to be the answer. If anything else, you probably need to fund more.
Mm-hmm.
Police officers historically don't make as much money in that area of profession that they could,
Right.
and some others. We need to pay our folks real well in order to get the very best and brightest. If you pay less, you're going to get what you pay for. We've all heard that,
Right.
and we know it to be true.
Mm-hmm.
You can buy a $6 water bottle, or you can buy maybe a $20 water bottle. Which one's going to hold up over time?
Mm-hmm.
Probably the one you pay a little bit more money for.
Right.
And it's the same way with salaries and training funds that you need. That's the other part about law enforcement is you gotta devote some time to train. Not only time, but also money to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
It's extremely important to do that. And I wonder, in retrospect, talking about Uvalde, I wonder if they've received all the training that they could have, received.
Mm-hmm.
Are they making as much money as they could possibly make, for being a police officer there?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Sure.
Unanswered questions.
And this training, Chief, when you talk about training, it's rigorous, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's not just a pencil on a board. I mean, you're out training.
Oh yeah. I know one of the last big ones that we did was, and we great partners at Lewisville Independent School District to be able to use any of their facilities that we wanted to train our folks in. And so they had the big career center out east. So we did a huge exercise out there. And usually it starts with a refresher review, this kind of classroom, but then you form teams and you actually go in and you're looking for active shooters. Mm-hmm. We have actors that are volunteers that are made up to represent casualties and hurt folks in the school. Mm-hmm. And we put into play that whole process that we've been trained on how to respond to an active shooter, mm-hmm. Live during that incident.
Yeah.
We'll have, medevac helicopters, land nearby. We'll do it full blown, just like it was a real deal.
Right.
And I think without doing that, you're going to be ill-equipped to deal with it when it really does happen.
Right. It has to become instinctual instead
Absolutely.
of having to think about every move you make. Right. Were there back in 1978? Were there any women police officers back then?
We actually had one. Phyllis Adams was one of the first female officers that we hired. I think she was hired on before I started. I think she was hired on in '76, and she's only here a couple of years. By the time I came on, I think she was here when I was a reserve officer because I remember her being on some of the same shifts that I would work on. But I think by the time I had gone regular, she had already moved on.
Mm. Chief, you're very laid back. I mean, I only know one speed that you have, and it's a very laid back speed. Very enjoy life and all that. How did you keep egos in check?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For the most part, I think if I'm calm and reasonable and rational when I discuss things with people who are somewhat hot-headed or, kind of egotistical, if you will, then that helps to make it a more manageable situation for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you can't be a chief of police without having a little bit of an ego yourself too. Mm-hmm. I've been doing this was doing this for a long time. Mm-hmm. So it's not like I don't know anything. Mm-hmm. And that's always the kind of funny thing about people when they come in and come in from maybe out of state or out of town, you know, whether it's a resident or it's another police officer that's, you know, joined your ranks, is, you know, that thought that somehow or another, you know, we don't know as much as they know in LA or New York City or anything like that.
Right.
I'll tell you, we do. The unsung heroes of law enforcement are really the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the Metroplex. We have absolutely some of the best qualified folks doing the job, the best training that you can get anywhere. You know, the Texas Best Practices program has been in existence for a while. You know, most other states don't really have that. Now, there is an accreditation thing that's a national deal, but we always thought that was really kind of, it was kind of an overblown program. You know, a lot more standards than what the Texas program does, and it's stuff that doesn't really apply here. It applies in places like California or places like New York City, perhaps, but they don't really apply here. Our Texas system is based upon Texas law enforcement, and so, you know, and it's also the CALEA thing is extremely expensive. You know, it's not quite so expensive if we do the Texas Best Practices program. And, you know, we have some of the very best minds that work on that program each and every day. It was 160 some odd when we started, but I know they've moved on from that. They're always constantly looking at new things to, you know, hone people's skills and to add more requirements to the program.
Lewisville is a great place to live, and of course you were instrumental in building it that way. But you always had a real close relationship with city management, and you still do. You were very instrumental in raising the money for the new facility that should be breaking ground sometime this year.
Knock on wood.
Briefly, how excited are you about building a new facility for the police department?
Well, it's a long time coming for sure. You know, the facility they're in now was first built in 1984. We were right here in downtown, Old Town, before that. I worked out of a little station house that sat on where basically the stage is for the Ferguson Plaza.
Right.
So we were outgrowing that, you know, pretty quickly. And so in '84 we opened up the original spot. There have been, I think, 4 additions since then. The administration has moved out of the main headquarters. It is on the 2nd floor of the annex, which is right next door. We built a whole brand new jail standalone between the 2 buildings. And so, you know, we've been expanding a lot. And I know that, you know, for me, when I was the chief, I would have loved to have all my guys, all my people in the same building, you know, and they'll be able to do that with this newer facility. Now, I don't want to speak for the fire department too much, but I think they know that central station, that sucker was built, they were building it when I was still in high school. And so, and it's had some modifications since then, but essentially that foundation of that building, you know, is pretty darn old. And so they need a new central station and a place for their administration to work out of. We're
all excited about it, Chief, and you did a great job being instrumental in raising the money, the bonds for that. We love you. You are just Lewisville. You think of Lewisville, you think of Chief Becky Kerbow. Great family traditions. We're so proud of you, and we're so grateful that you are still a part of our community. I appreciate you being here. Terry Sullivan Show. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next time.